we're going to start with the brain, right? We'll start with the cranial nerves and kind of work our way down. So what I want you guys to be able to do is, for the lab practical, know the locations of the cranial nerves, and for the lab or for the lecture exam, to understand like the names of the cranial nerves and a little bit about the functions, at least the major ones. So there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves, and they originate from the brain. We talked about a little bit earlier about which part of the brainstem or the brain that they originate from, so we'll mention that. They're part of the peripheral nervous system because they're nerves, and they're numbered with Roman numerals according to their position. So it begins with the most anterior located nerve and comes down. The name of the nerve is often related to its function. So we can see here in this sort of actual specimen and then this little specimen here. So we start with the olfactory nerve, which is cranial nerve 1, the optic, which is cranial nerve 2, oculomotor, which is 3, trochlear, which is 4, then we have trigeminal, which is 5, we go medial for abducens, which is 6, come a little bit further lateral, facial, which is 7, and then right next to that and a little bit more inferior is vestibulocochlear, which is 8. We have 9 is glossopharyngeal, 10 is vagus, that's a big one, 11 is the accessory nerve or spinal accessory nerve, and then come medial again for 12, which is hypoglossal. So I'm going to start just going through the different nerves. So this first one is the olfactory nerve. It starts here. These are technically the little olfactory nerves coming from the olfactory epithelium. We'll learn more about this in chapter 16. They go up through the holes in the cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, and then they're going to meet the olfactory bulb. And so this is their nerves here because it's part of the peripheral nervous system. Now this is the central nervous system. This is the olfactory tract that goes down to the cerebral cortex. And this is special sensory nerve that conducts smell, so it's sensory, to the nose. Next we have the optic nerve. So remember, number 1 is 1, you have 1 nose. Number 2 is optic, you have 2 eyes. So we have an optic nerve that leaves the eye and then comes back here to the brain, and they cross at what's called the optic chiasm. So chi looks like an X, so it crosses like an X of the chiasm. And then after the optic chiasm, they continue back as the optic tract. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in chapter 16 with our special sensory. This one is also sensory for vision. So we can see here it says this is going to be sensory for smell. This one is sensory for vision. These slides and these tables in your book have a little bit more information than you need to memorize, but go through. So cranial nerve 3 is the oculomotor nerve. So oculo, like oculo is eye, motor means motor to the eye. So it is motor to the eye. It controls most of the muscles that move the eye, lift the eyelid, change the pupil diameter, change the lens shape. And so it innervates 4 of the 6 extrinsic eye muscles, and we'll learn more about these extrinsic eye muscles in chapter 16, next lab, I think. It also innervates an upper eyelid muscle and the intrinsic eye muscles, so within the eye. And that's going to be the ones that cause constriction of the pupil, as well as the ones that, the ciliary muscles that change the shape of the lens. We have cranial nerve 4, which is the trochlear nerve. So the trochlear nerve, this is another eye muscle nerve, but it is the only one, and it only goes to this specific extrinsic eye muscle called the superior oblique. So the superior oblique. And this is the trochlea. So it comes around this pulley here. And so the trochlear nerve innervates the superior oblique, which goes around the trochlea. So this is motor also. Trigeminal, this is a big one. So it's cranial nerve 5, as you can see here, and it's got this really big ganglion, and then it spreads all over. And so this one is going to be a mixed nerve. So it has both motor and sensory functions. So it's going to be motor to the muscles of mastication. So it's a nice alliteration there. Motor to the muscles of mastication, so like the masseter and the temporalis. And it's going to be sensory to the face. So sensory to the face, motor to the muscles of mastication. Now, cranial nerve 6 is going to be another eye muscle. And so this is another one. It's going to go specifically to this one muscle called the lateral rectus. So the lateral rectus is innervated by cranial nerve 6. The superior oblique is innervated by cranial nerve 4. And the cranial nerve 3 innervates the medial rectus, the inferior rectus, the superior rectus, and the inferior oblique. So those are the other 4 extrinsic eye muscles. And they're a little bit confusing now because we haven't really learned them, but we will learn them more next lab. So cranial nerve 7 is called the facial nerve. As you can see, this is another one that's big and it reaches to a lot of different areas. This one controls the muscles of facial expression. So it's motor to the muscles of facial expression. And then it's going to be sensory to part of the tongue. Cranial nerve 8 is vestibulocochlear, and this is all about the ear. So it's going to go into the inner ear, so it's important in it's sensory for hearing as well as balance and equilibrium. Once again, we'll learn more about this whole apparatus here in lab in 2 weeks when we get to the sensory system. Cranial nerve 9 is the glossopharyngeal nerve. So glosso means tongue, pharyngeal is throat. So this is a mixed nerve. It's motor and sensory. It receives taste and touch from the tongue. So some taste sensations as well as touch, and is motor control of some of the throat muscles, some of the pharynx muscles. Now the vagus nerve, this one's really big. So obviously, look, this is a bunch of stuff that the vagus nerve innervates. The vagus nerve is a mixed nerve. It's really big. It comes all the way down, and it's going to control like our thoracic and abdominal viscera, most of them. And it's going to be very important. It also controls some of the stuff in the larynx, and it's a major source of parasympathetic output. The accessory nerve or spinal accessory nerve is cranial nerve 11. It's a motor nerve that controls muscles of the neck, so like the sternocleidomastoid muscle. So it's a little bit smaller than the vagus nerve. And then finally we have cranial nerve 12, which is the hypoglossal nerve. And so this one is a motor nerve that controls the tongue. So it kind of comes up, under, and then goes in to control the tongue muscles. So those are your 12 pairs. So that means you have a left and a right of each of them. 24 total, 12 paired cranial nerves. Now this is another view where you can kind of see where they come out of the bottom of the brain. So that's going to help you with your labeling. I really like this one. I know it's a little bit blurry, but it kind of goes through, it shows where they come from. Any of them that have these red fibers, that's going to say they're sensory. And if it's only red, they're only sensory. If it's red and blue, it means it's mixed. So it's going to be motor and sensory. And if they're only blue, that means it's just motor. And then it has a little picture of what it innervates and a very like a brief, a brief description of the function. And I like these brief descriptions of the functions a little bit more than those big ones that your book has. And now this one, here are some good mnemonics to memorize. So to know the names of the cranial nerves, so this is in order from 1 to 12. So it's listed out in order from 1 to 12. And so to remember the names, this is going to help us remember the first letter of each of them. So on occasion, our trusty truck acts funny, very good vehicle anyhow, is one of them. Or you can say, oh, once one takes the anatomy final, very good vacations are heavenly. There are a couple other ones you can look up that are a little bit, I don't know, a little bit more memorable. So I'll let you guys look those up, or you can make up your own. And the crash course gives you a couple of different ones you can look at too. So this is how to remember the first letter of each one of these. Now the first 3 are O's, and that can get a little confusing, but I remember that you have 1 nose, so it's number 1. You have 2 eyes, so it's number 2. That helps a little bit. Now the other thing to know is whether if they have sensory fibers, motor fibers, or both. So if they're just sensory, we say sensory. If they're just motor, we say motor. If they have both, then it's both. So we can do, S for sensory, M for motor, and B for both. And so the only one that I've really heard for this one is some say merry money, but my brother says big brains matter more. And so that goes down 1 through 12 to help you remember which is sensory and which is motor and which is both. So which cranial nerves have sensory functions only? So you can go through, some say merry money, so that's 1 and 2 are sensory, but my brother says, so right there, says 8, big brains matter more. So 1, 2, and 8 are the ones that are sensory. So just like write down 1 through 12, and then you can write down the first letter of the name as well as sensory, motor, or both, and you've got a good start there. And the names can sometimes help you with the functions too. All right, so now this is kind of a review. We're going to move down. So any nerves that leave from the brain are going to be called cranial nerves, and any nerves that leave from the spinal cord are called spinal nerves. Spinal nerves are going to be, you have 31 pairs of them, and we talked about this last week. 8 cervical, and then you have 12 thoracic, and then you have 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. So remember those. But how the spinal nerve is made, remember, so we look here, here's our spinal cord. Now we have our anterior and our posterior nerve roots coming out together, and then they form to form the spinal nerve. And then our spinal nerves are going to split, and we have the posterior ramus going to the back muscles. The anterior ramus is the main big one, and then our rami communicantes. And this is going to make up the sympathetic trunk, and we'll talk about that at the very end, about the sympathetic trunk ganglion. So you should have memorized this last week, hopefully. So what we're really going to focus on now is this anterior ramus. The anterior ramus is the part that goes on to participate in plexuses and eventually make named nerves. And so we're going to look at the anterior ramuses and what kind of happens to them. Another sort of clinical application of this is something called a dermatome. And a dermatome is a segment of skin that's supplied by a single spinal nerve. So if we go through here, like this guy right here is going to go out, and it's going to supply the skin. It's going to be sensory to some part of the skin. And so we've got this little map that says that, you know, cranial nerve 2, cranial nerve 3, cranial nerve 4. So this is a map that's been made to say that this is a segment of the skin that is going to be supplied by that single cranial nerve. There is some overlap in innervated regions, but it's kind of this general area. This can help localize damage to one or more spinal nerves. So if you have loss of sensation to an area, so loss of sensation on the medial arm and forearm indicates C8 damage. So we can look here and say that the medial arm and the forearm right here is going to be innervated by C8. So you might say, oh, there's damage to C8 that way. This can also be involved in something called referred visceral pain. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the autonomic nervous system, so in chapter 15. But just, I guess, remember this when we get there. I'm not going to ask you about referred pain until we talk about it, but they are involved in that. So shingles is something that kind of we'll talk about dermatomes with. Shingles is a reactivation of the chickenpox infection. So it's a virus that remains latent. So it means it's kind of hiding in the posterior root ganglion. So it would be up here. So it kind of, after chickenpox, the virus remains there and hides from your immune system for years, a lot of times. And if it's reactivated by stress or something, it can travel through the sensory axons to the dermatome. And so it'll travel through the sensory portions here, all the way out to the dermatome. So wherever area that this is supplying sensory innervation to. And so the patient will often have rashes and blisters along the dermatome, and it's usually fairly like well demarcated. So it's going to be just in one specific area, and they'll have burning and tingling pain coming from that nerve. And so sometimes this can be something that goes away on its own, but sometimes you can use antiviral medication to reduce severity. I think there's also a vaccine for it. Yes, there is. It says there in the slide. So the next thing I want to mention is nerve plexuses. So these nerve plexuses are going to be what happens to the anterior rami. So the anterior rami are actually, instead of just going and making one nerve each, they're going to branch and form this like meshwork. So they all come together and then they kind of share little pieces and then they spread apart, so that you have a lot of different nerves that are made up of areas from different, like a lot of different named nerves, like your radial and ulnar nerve, that are made up of, have axons that come from a few different cranial nerves. And the individual rami are going to branch repeatedly. So damage to one nerve or spinal segment doesn't deprive a muscle or skin region of all the innervation. So it's a little bit like collateral innervation, or just like a backup, so that we don't just have like one cranial nerve segment to one nerve. They kind of mix so that there's a little bit of a backup there. So there are 4 main plexuses that occur bilaterally. We have the cervical, then we have the brachial. Now your thoracic nerves do not really participate in these plexuses. They're going to make your intercostal nerves. And then we have our lumbar and sacral plexuses. So we'll start looking through here. So if you have your lab manual, you've got a chart to fill out some of this information. So the cervical plexuses are made up of the anterior rami of cranial nerves 1 through cranial nerves 4. Cranial nerve 5 contributes a few axons, but not that many. And so they're going to kind of form that little meshwork and branch, and eventually they're going to give off nerves that innervate the neck muscles, the skin of the neck, portions of the head. But the bottom part of it, some rami of C3 to C5, give rise to a special nerve called the phrenic nerve. And the phrenic nerve is the named nerve to know, and it innervates the diaphragm. And so if you look here, These are going to be, you can see how all of these nerves come out and then they branch and they merge together and then they branch off again to form these different nerves. And so the phrenic nerve is this one down here, and that's going to be the one that's going to go innervate the diaphragm, which is your muscle for breathing. So that's pretty important. The next one as we go down is the brachial plexus, and it's formed from the anterior rami of C5 through T1. It's going to be a little bit confusing. Eventually, if you really want to learn more about the brachial plexus, there's different trunks and there's different cords. You guys don't need to know that much for here, though. Just know that it starts from cranial nerves C5 through T1. And so most of these are going to innervate the upper limbs. So it goes down to the arms. So it gives rise to 5 major terminal branches, 3 of which you'll have to be able to identify for lab. So the axillary nerve, that's going to go and innervate your armpit area. The median nerve, this is one you need to know for lab. This is motor to most of the anterior forearm muscles and sensory input from the palmar side and dorsal tips of most fingers, but not the pinky. So that's the median nerve. It goes down the middle. The musculocutaneous nerve is a little bit more superficial. Cutaneous means it's like the cutaneous area. It's between the muscle and cutaneous area. Next is the radial nerve. This one is another one that you need to know for lab. So that's why I have its information here. The radial nerve is motor to the posterior arm muscles, whereas we had the anterior ones here, like the triceps. And the posterior forearm muscles, so upper arm and forearm. It's also sensory from the posterior arm and forearm and the dorsolateral hand. And then finally, our ulnar nerve, which is going to be on the pinky side, is motor to the anterior forearm muscles, most of the muscles of your hand, and has sensory input from the palm and dorsal aspect of the 2 medial fingers. So like your little finger over here especially. So if we look through here, we've got our brachial plexus and it comes down and it splits. And then you can see this one running all the way down here is the ulnar nerve. Then we've got this one running down here is the median nerve that comes down the middle. And then our radial nerve is a little bit more complicated. So it comes down over here and it has some deep and superficial branches and it kind of wraps around. But it's going to be on the thumb side. So the ulnar nerve is on the pinky side, the radial nerve is on the thumb side, and then the median nerve is in the middle. Next, we're going to move down, and we said that thoracic nerves do not participate in plexuses. They are going to become the intercostal nerves. So we can see this is the thoracic nerve, and so what it does is we have these prominent rami communicantes that are going to make up the sympathetic trunk ganglion. So we'll talk about the sympathetic trunk in a little bit. And then the anterior rami, instead of participating in plexuses, they go ahead and they make the intercostal nerves. So there's one in between each pair of ribs. And this is going to innervate those intercostal muscles. Now, if we move down further, our next is going to be the lumbar plexus, and it's made from anterior rami of L1 through L4. And the 2 big nerves to know that come from the lumbar plexus are the femoral nerve and the obturator nerve. But really, the only one you need to memorize for lecture is the femoral nerve. So this is the main nerve in the posterior division of the plexus. It's going to innervate the anterior thigh muscles and the sartorius. So you'll see it on the model on the anterior side of the leg. And it has sensory input from the anterior and sort of medial part of the thigh. So it's more anterior and medial. The obturator nerve, you don't have to identify in lab. It's actually going to go, if we look here, this is the lumbar plexus, and we can see here. So we've got the obturator nerve is going to come through that obturator foramen that we learned about in the pelvis. The femoral nerve is this big nerve that comes down here, and it comes down like over to the femur. It's going to come in the front, the anterior side of the femur, so it comes in front of it. And then as the femoral nerve keeps going down, it's eventually going to become the saphenous nerve, but you don't need to know that for this identification-wise. Now, the last one is the sacral plexus. The sacral plexus is made of the anterior rami of L4 through S4, and it makes up the sciatic nerve, which is the longest and largest nerve in the body, and it has 2 divisions. And the anterior divisions are going to be for the flexor muscles, and the posterior divisions are more the extensor muscles. So the sciatic nerve is formed from portions of both anterior and posterior sacral plexus. It's composed of it breaks up into the tibial and common fibular nerves. And so the tibial nerve is from the anterior division of the sciatic. It innervates your hamstrings and part of the adductor magnus muscle, so it's on the medial side here. the superficial fibular nerve. Hopefully that recording is still working. Next we have, so we can see the sacral plexus here. So this is going to be, both of these are going to give rise to the sciatic nerve right here. And that sciatic nerve is then going to split. So here's the sciatic, it's giant, it's long, it comes down here and it splits into the tibial, which goes straight down here down the back. And then the common fibular, which kind of wraps around on the lateral side because the fibula is on the lateral side. So now the last couple slides that we'll go through are the sympathetic trunks and the ganglia. We'll learn about this in the autonomic nervous system this week. And your rami communicantes, coming especially from the thoracolumbar sections, are going to form what's called a sympathetic trunk. There are some ganglia also in the cervical area, but not quite as many. So there's a left and right trunk that are going right next to the vertebrae, and the trunk resembles a pearl necklace. So there's the string would be the axons, and the pearls are going to be the sympathetic trunk ganglia that house the cell bodies. So it's going to be this guy right here where we've got this, this is the string of the sympathetic trunk here, and the ganglia are these like wider areas. So the sympathetic trunk ganglia, and you can see like the little sort of axons that connect them together. And so on our model here, you can see that this part, these pink parts here are the sympathetic trunk ganglia. And then you can see these little yellow parts here are going to be the areas, they're the rami communicantes. And there's a white ramus and a gray ramus that are going to be like exits and entrances from the sympathetic trunk. And we'll talk more about that in lecture. So make sure that you can identify the sympathetic trunk ganglion. There should be one on either side. It's just only shown on this, the right side in this picture. And we can also see these are the intercostal nerves coming from the thoracic spinal nerves. So as I said, the rami communicantes are made of a white and a gray ramus. And the white ramus carries myelinated preganglionic sympathetic axons. Those are like the entrance ramps to the trunk. So right, they're myelinated. So they are the white ramus because myelin is white. And the gray ramus is going to be unmyelinated because gray matter is unmyelinated. Those are like the exit ramps from the trunk. We'll go over this again in lecture when we talk more about the autonomic nervous system. It might make more sense then. Now, generally, through the thoracic and lumbar areas, you have one ganglion associated with each spinal segment. So you can see one associated with each spinal segment. But in the cervical areas, you don't have quite that many. You only have 3. And so you have a superior cervical ganglion, a middle cervical ganglion, and an inferior cervical ganglion. And we can see them on this model. So we have the superior cervical ganglion, the middle, and the inferior cervical ganglion. And then we can see the phrenic nerve is this guy over here that comes out of the cervical plexus. That is it for this lab. I'm going to, if you have any questions, just email me and let me know. I'll stop recording now.